Kristian Coates Ulrichsen, PhD, is a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East. He works across disciplines of political science, international relations, and international political economy, and his research examines the changing position of Persian Gulf states in the global order, as well as the emergence of long-term, non-military challenges to regional security. Previously, he worked as senior Gulf at the Gulf Center for Strategic Study in 2006 and 2008, and as co-director of the Kuwait Program Development, Governance, and Globalization in the Gulf States at the London School of Economics from 2008 until 2013. Dr. Ulrichsen holds a doctorate in history from Cambridge, and his list of publications are, of course, available in his bio on our website. Today, Dr. Ulrichsen joins us from Cambridge. He will speak to us about the stability of Saudi Arabia for about 20 minutes, and we will hold a question and answer session afterward. If you have a question, write it through your feature at any time during the remarks, your question and answer feature. I will gather the questions and I will ask them for you at the end, and we will get to as many questions as we can in an hour. Thank you so much, Dr. Ulrichsen.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Morgan, for the introduction and for putting this together and for making it possible to connect in these extraordinary times that we're all finding ourselves in. I would perhaps begin by making the point that this 2020 is not the 2020 that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, was expecting. This was supposed to be the year that Saudi Arabia hosts the G20. This was supposed to be Mohammed bin Salman's re-emergence on the global stage after a period of time in the sin bin, as it were, following the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi in October 2018 and the subsequent international criticism that came his way. The presidency of the G20 was not just a one-off big summit in Riyadh in November. The Saudis have also organized parallel events as a Business 2020, a Civil Society 2020, Think Tank 2020. All sorts of events had been planned in Riyadh during the course of this year. To some extent, they had been planned as an exercise in prestige, nation and state branding, in branding Saudi Arabia to its international audience, again, trying to rebuild some of the momentum that Mohammed bin Salman had tried to galvanize in 2016 and 2017, and which had peaked in his visit to the US in March and April 2018, when he was the big ticket in town, and which he had lost in October. So the 2020 G20 process was supposed to be really about, once again, stamping Saudi Arabia as an international actor that was part of the global community. I don't think anyone could have expected that suddenly this global crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic would not only mean that events could no longer be held in person, even the leaderships of the G20 held their own Zoom or at least virtual meeting last week, but it also now requires the Saudi leadership to try and play an active role in a global response, in shaping a response, a coordinated response internationally that can at least be as successful as the 2008 G20 was in trying to do the same for the global financial crisis. So it's a very different G20 than perhaps the Saudis would have expected in even 2 to 3 months ago. And of course, this is all taking place against the backdrop of the oil price collapse, of the Saudi decision to respond to the breakdown of the OPEC Plus agreement in March by, in the views of many people, including President Trump, and of course, Texas Senator Ted Cruz, who yesterday referred to an economic warfare strategy, very much again casting Saudis almost for the first time since 1973 as using oil as a political tool in a geopolitical struggle. And the senior princes who were summoned for questioning at the beginning of this month, in March, which has once again raised questions about the decision-making in Riyadh, and really about where Mohammed bin Salman intends to take Saudi Arabia as a 34-year-old who could become king and remain king for 40 to 50 years if he plays his cards right. There's clearly a lot of interest in how will he rule a kingdom which is now almost 100 years old, but has been ruled by the same generation the last 60 plus, almost 70 years now. So after a quiet period following the Jamal Khashoggi murder, when Mohammed bin Salman really bunkered down and resisted international pressure, including congressional pressure in the US, to hold not only his inner circle, but he himself to account for the death of Khashoggi, and in which he was to some extent shielded from that pressure by the White House, which has consistently rebuffed political attempts to impose sanctions, at least on the Saudi leadership, for their supposed role in his death. After a quiet period, we've now seen a much more renewed focus on Mohammed bin Salman and on Saudi Arabia going forward at a time of such global uncertainty. I think what I'd begin by saying is that we had these two events, the detention of senior princes, including former Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, and the king's only surviving full brother, Prince Ahmed, on the 5th of March, and the very next day, almost simultaneously, was the collapse of the OPEC Plus agreement. So within 24 hours, we had these two extremely volatile decisions being taken at pretty much the same week that almost a lot of the global economy was beginning to shut down because of the pandemic. I'll just say at the beginning that the senior prince's detention signifies, I think, that the king is still very much in place. There was a lot of rumor going around those feverish hours, suggesting the king was ill, that Mohammed bin Salman was perhaps acting in anticipation of an imminent succession. Did he know something that we didn't? But I think it's very clear that the king remains fully in at least recognition of what's going on and very much in charge. And we have to remember that King Salman, as a senior prince, in fact, the last senior prince of his generation, is perhaps the only senior Saudi prince who could have orchestrated a situation where he's placed a royal who was almost unknown 6 or 7 years ago into a position of such unprecedented power and authority. Salman, when he was the governor of Riyadh for 49 years, between 1962 and 2011, was really the sort of chief whip of the royal family. He kept the family discipline in check. He knew how to balance family interests. And as a succession of other senior royals passed away between 2010 and 2015, leaving him as the next king, he made sure that the vacuum that was opening up with the death of so many princes who had been in power in their positions for 40 plus years was filled by Mohammed bin Salman. And perhaps only someone with such intuitive knowledge of royal family dynamics, and somebody who was as respected as he was feared by other members of his family, could have orchestrated such an outcome, almost like a conductor or playing the orchestra. That said, Saudi Arabia, until very recently, until at least the early 2010s, had always been a collection of senior princes exercising power collectively in a form of consensus. And one of the criticisms of Saudi policy making for many years was that Saudi policy was extremely slow. It moved very slowly and often couldn't keep pace with rapidly unfolding developments. And one of the reasons for that was precisely because you had 5 or 6 very senior princes, the king, the crown prince, the minister of defense, the minister of foreign affairs, the Minister of Interior, and Prince Abdullah, the National Guard, who were each very powerful and expected to be consulted on all major events before a decision was taken. This meant that there was at least a system of checks and balances that precipitated against militated against this sort of dynamic yet unpredictable, even volatile decision-making we've come to expect from Mohammed bin Salman. So until fairly recently, there was a very different decision-making structure in Saudi Arabia from what we see today. Now, Mohammed bin Salman may have felt that he had to act to eliminate any potential of any other family member from potentially questioning his rise to king. It was perhaps no surprise that the two princes who were named in the most recent arrests were the former Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, a man who is 25 years older than Mohammed bin Salman, who has worked closely with US security and defense officials when he was at the Ministry of Interior for more than 20 years, a man who's developed close relationships with Western intelligence agencies, who was trusted as a safe pair of hands to guide Saudi Arabia from one generation of rule of the king and his brothers to the next. In the views of many in the West, that safe pair of hands was Mohammed bin Nayef. And Prince Ahmed, the surviving brother of King Salman, had been named by many as a potentially compromised candidate should Mohammed bin Salman ever do something that he was not able to recover from. In 2015, there were several letters that were written by an unknown member of the royal family that were sharply critical of Mohammed bin Salman, and they named Ahmed as one of three senior princes who would be acceptable as a short-term compromise candidate to become king while the family figured out what might happen next. And of those three princes, two of them, including Prince Talal bin Abdulaziz, have now passed away. Ahmed is the only one left. So Mohammed bin Salman may have been thinking that he had to just make the family remember, as he did in 2017 with the Ritz-Carlton detentions, that any potential contestation of his position would be met with an iron fist. And from the Crown Prince's position, any potential where the king, who's 84, would be incapacitated for any length of time if, for example, King Salman were to be out of the picture through ill health for a number of years before becoming king. I think Mohammed bin Salman wants to make sure that he is firmly entrenched in his position. The memories are still fresh of how King Fahad had a stroke in 1995 and only died 10 years later in 2005. And I think Mohammed bin Salman wants to make sure that should that lengthy period of time while a king is on medical leave, as it were, would not be a potential time of vulnerability for his accession to king. We are seeing Mohammed bin Salman remaking the Saudi state. He is he's keen to refer to it as the fourth Saudi state. There was a Saudi state established in the 18th century, one again in the 19th century, the one that his grandfather, the founding king of modern Saudi Arabia, put together after 1932 is the third Saudi state. He's keen on putting together, in his view, the fourth. Rather than a collective decision-making where influence is spread across senior members of the family, this fourth Saudi state is really run by one branch, the branch of King Salman and his sons. And we should remember here, it's not just Mohammed bin Salman, it's Khalid bin Salman, his brother, who is 31 years old, he's even younger, who's Deputy Minister of Defense. And because he can still travel internationally, unlike Mohammed bin Salman, who's had trouble traveling to Western countries since 2018, Khalid bin Salman has done a lot of the work on, for example, Yemen, and on working with US officials to try and reach a resolution to the Yemen conflict. And then, of course, the other brother is Abdulaziz bin Salman, Mohammed bin Salman's much older half-brother, who since September 2019 has become energy minister, and of course was the one who was at co-chair of the OPEC Plus meeting at which the decision to rapidly increase Saudi oil production was taken. So this fourth Saudi state is really run by an offshoot, a branch of the royal family in a way that Saudi Arabia was never run before. And for all of its many faults, Saudi Arabia has never been a dictatorship. It's never been a one-man show. It was never in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. The fact that you had 5 or 6 senior figures meant there were always spaces to debate policy. There were spaces for individuals to rise to actually influence policymaking. And all of that has become questionable as Mohammed bin Salman has concentrated power to an extent unprecedented, at least since the death of the founding king in 1953, and also has surrounded himself with an inner circle of individuals, many of whom are his age as well, who lack experience, who have not lived through previous upheavals in Saudi history, such as in the 1970s, which saw the assassination of King Faisal, the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca in 1979, and who seem to think that they could just remake Saudi Arabia with a blank slate, as if the past didn't matter, as if different groups of Saudi society were simply pieces on a chessboard. And some of the decision making that we saw with the Khashoggi murder really, I think, focused people's minds on whether it's wise or not to have a small inner circle of young people who were either for self-preservation to advance their careers, didn't seem to be willing to to provide a second opinion, to suggest to Mohammed bin Salman that perhaps you need to think again about a policy, that perhaps you should actually go a bit slower. They all seem to be encouraging him and actually surrounding him with a sort of yes men that we actually did see with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman is no Saddam himself, but being surrounded by a very small inner circle of people who tell you what you want to hear and who don't necessarily provide a second opinion is something we've seen before, and it didn't end well for Saddam Hussein. Mohammed bin Salman therefore has total control of the royal court, and that probably accounts for some of the volatility in decision-making. Think about the decision to go into Yemen in 2015, the decision to launch the blockade of Qatar in 2017, the arrest of Lebanese Prime Minister Saud Hariri in 2017 as well, the diplomatic spats with Germany, with Canada. We've seen a consistent pattern of a plan A, an attempt to kind of have a shock and awe, not necessarily being followed through by a plan B, a sort of feeling that sometimes decisions aren't necessarily thought through, the consequences of a potential decision or scenario planning. If something happens, what happens next? And we may be seeing that with the most recent oil decision as well. From a security perspective as well, there were certainly officials in the US and in the UK as well who have observed that since Mohammed bin Salman concentrated the security and defense apparatus under his control in 2017, whereas in the past you had Mohammed bin Nayef controlling the Ministry of Interior, you had a separate Ministry of Defense, and you had Abdullah and his son controlling the National Guard. So there was never one monopoly on security and defense, whereas now there is under Mohammed bin Salman. And it has been observed, at least, that there has been a decline in the quality of some of the intelligence that's being shared. And this has caused some concern along the lines of, what are we missing? What potential buildup of discontent or radicalization, or at least of frustration within Saudi Arabia might we not be seeing, or might the Saudis themselves be missing? And in that respect, the shooting in December 2019 at the base in Pensacola in Florida came as a real concern to many officials, because it seemed to kind of reinforce that concern they had, that if even a highly vetted Saudi Air Force pilot who had been flown to the US for advanced training turned out to be radicalized and a a member of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Was that just the tip of the iceberg? Was he just an isolated case who happened to get to where he was? Or was there something deeper at play? And that was a concern because of the noticeable decline in some of that intelligence. So again, people are expressing some concern and saying perhaps that although Mohammed bin Salman may foresee his greatest challenge as coming from members of his own family, perhaps the challenge is if he doesn't deliver, if Mohammed bin Salman fails to deliver on Vision 2030, on all the promises he's made to Saudi youth, especially to Saudi society, he's promised to transform their economic prospects. And the danger of over-promising, as he has done, is that you want to deliver. So the concern then must be that if he does do that, if he fails to deliver, if say in 3, 4, 5 years, an average young Saudi still has no greater economic prospects than they do today, do people begin to lose faith in the system, and do pockets of radicalization begin to grow? So I think that potentially is the challenge he faces. Oil, again, has been used as a geopolitical tool. It has had the effect of driving oil prices down to extreme lows. The paradox and the challenge for Mohammed bin Salman is that for Vision 2030 to succeed, he needs oil prices at higher levels to boost those revenues, to then try and power that transition to a more private sector-led economy with also greater higher levels of foreign direct investment. Already we've seen Vision 2030 to some extent being pared down, almost focusing on Neom, the mega city he's trying to build on the west coast of Saudi Arabia. We've seen a focus on entertainment, on hospitality, on tourism, but not necessarily, very much paring down from the initial plan to try and transform the wider economy as a whole. And ironically, again, the coronavirus pandemic is hitting some of those very targets and very sectors that Vision 2030 was really putting its hopes on, especially the entertainment sector and hospitality. So it's going to make hitting those targets even more hard, even more difficult than they already were, especially if oil prices remain low and if investment into Saudi Arabia remains at its anemic levels. So we are seeing, or we will see, especially over the next 6 months and longer potentially, a critical test of whether Mohammed bin Salman can manage crises and unforeseen developments and potentially change course if he feels it's necessary, if he feels he has to. And again, the legacy of his decisions until now do suggest that there's been a plan A without necessarily being a plan B. Can he adapt? His past actions suggest he might not be. Very least, I suppose, the G20 offers an opportunity to insert into the global response a Saudi element of policy making. Saudi could at least lead the region or the Gulf region in trying to be part of the global solution. Even, of course, there's other issues such as the Yemen war. We saw missiles again yesterday hitting or being targeting the Saudis, being unresolved. So that's his paradox. He has this moment in the international spotlight, and it's how he chooses to use that, which I think will tell us a great deal about whether he has a plan B or he doesn't. So with that, I'll hand back to Morgan.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll just jump right into the questions. Everyone in the audience, which we have 89 people in the audience, by the way, so I think that's good to know. I have a couple of questions coming in through the chat. And then if you all look down at the bottom, there's a Q&A button that you can press and ask your question that way. For now, I'll start with Jim Tucker's question. He asks, he has 2 questions. One is, this morning, the US Embassy in Riyadh announced a charter exit flight from Riyadh for US expats with flights from, and then he lists 3 cities, which I will mispronounce, Dammam, Jeddah, and Riyadh to follow. How is the COVID-19 being reported in KSA?
Well, I have to give credit to the Saudi authorities. There has been a good deal of communication, and the Saudi government has actually been quite proactive in terms of imposing curfews, in very quickly moving towards a lockdown, and in really trying to communicate with the people that these are the sacrifices they're going to have to at least bear for a certain amount of time. The Saudis were very quick to suspend Umrah, which is the sort of year-round pilgrimage to Mecca. They suspended Umrah at the very beginning of March, even as most other countries were only beginning to move towards stronger measures. The big issue that the Saudis will have to face going forward is what to do about Hajj. Hajj takes place this year at the end of July, early August, and at least right now, it's almost inconceivable to imagine an event of that size to take place, especially as Muslims from all over the world will, in other circumstances, converge on Mecca and be in extremely close proximity. So for religious reasons alone, the Saudis have felt they've had to act very soon or very quickly and take it very seriously, and they have. And these exit flights are being arranged, but there certainly have been people, US and other British and Western citizens, who have been looking at the response elsewhere and thinking that at least for the short term, they might actually be better off in Saudi Arabia. The problem being, of course, they might not get another chance to fly home.
And he also asked, what is the situation like in the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia where there have been repressions of the population?
Well, the eastern province has been sealed off, and this again is potentially problematic because it goes into that whole cycle of contestation where people in the eastern province, especially Shia, believe they're treated differently and at a worse level. And so sealing off the entire region, even though there have been certainly cases reported in the eastern province, could also be seen down the line as another grievance by the local population, by the local community. And of course, this, as everyone knows, is where almost all of Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure is based. So they'll be watching at least to see if the sealing off of the region does potentially constitute another political cause of discontent.
Mm-hmm. Frederico Brown would like to know, do you have any estimates of Saudi's break-even price for crude oil? And do you believe that the recent announcement of Saudi Arabia to flood the market with oil during the start of a pandemic was coordinated to some degree with their duopoly partner, Russia?
Well, the commonly cited break-even price is between 80 and 85. Now, clearly that's way above the sort of prices we're seeing now. When we had the price collapse in 2014, the Saudis drew down their foreign reserves quite alarmingly and eventually had to cut government spending by up to 20%. And they've actually already announced a 5% cut in government spending. So they're beginning to think about how they can adapt to a low price environment, at least in the short term. As for whether the decision to flood the market at a time, of course, of rapidly reducing demand as well, so you have an oversupplied market just as demand has dropped away. This wasn't taken necessarily with any Russian involvement. In fact, it was a response to Russia, I think, almost a desire to sort of remind the Russians that the Saudis remain the main player in OPEC or OPEC plus. There were, I think, concerns in Saudi that Russia and other OPEC members and other non-OPEC members may have been trying to meet behind Saudi's backs to coordinate a cut in production. And that may have been what triggered the Saudi response and the sort of breakdown in goodwill that led to the OPEC plus decision or agreement foundering. And the Saudis have certainly responded in a much more aggressive way than I think anyone really could have predicted.
And so related, as David Newberger says, how long can Saudi continue to maintain their current energy strategy, which has led to major problems in Texas? Will they be likely to blink first?
Well, there's the other option. I mean, the other issue there, of course, is US pressure on Saudi Arabia. We saw Ted Cruz's comments yesterday accusing the Saudis of economic warfare. We've seen President Trump get into the discussion as well. The Saudis will not, if the Saudis feel that they're going to be the ones who get the blame for driving shale almost out of business, or for having extremely negative knock-on effects in the US, especially for a president who focuses so closely on economic issues, that pressure might be a way of the Saudis blinking first. They won't want to back down. Mohammed bin Salman, I think, has shown in the past, he's not one to back down. But what we might see, for example, is just Saudis deciding not to increase to 10.5 million barrels export per day. They might just increase at a lesser level. That might be a face-saving way down the line of not following through to the extent that you've said you would. Not necessarily saying we're going to back down, but just not following through, and then presenting that as almost a conciliation measure for US consumption, especially if we get closer to the election and President Trump feels that in some of the swing states that he feels he has to win, if he feels that some of the decisions the Saudis have been taking could be harming his prospects, things could get very tense indeed, and the Saudis won't want to turn necessarily on the White House, especially after this White House has done so much to shield Mohammed bin Salman from the Khashoggi fallout.
Okay, thanks. And I have a few questions, and they're phrased in different ways, but people want to know about the opposition to MBS. And Mark Finley, who's one of our fellows, would like to know, you said that he's got a window to show progress. If not, what would opposition look like and where would it come from? Alan Livingston says, around whom would opposition to MBS possibly gravitate to in the royal family? Brent John says, if MBS were to lose legitimacy, how likely could he be deposed? What would that removal or resignation look like?
Well, in terms of the family, I think that's why he acted to move so decisively against Mohammed bin Nayef and Ahmed, because they were the two who were seen as the potential sort of compromise candidates, in the sense that if Mohammed bin Salman was removed, there would have to be some sort of compromise or consensus candidate around whom the family could come together, at least in the shorter term, while they tried to figure out a longer succession plan. Ahmed, at 77 years old, widely respected, has been critical of the Crown Prince in the past, and of course Mohammed bin Nayef, as I said earlier, very close to Western and especially US officials. So I think that's why Mohammed bin Salman has been trying to make sure that there is no one within the family who would be a viable rallying point around whom disgruntled members of the family could potentially coalesce. The difficulty is, as he moves even more like this, you could have more members of the family being disgruntled. I think he's just trying to cover his base by making sure there's no family member who has the gravitas to be that figure. And the king, I think, has also given his seal of approval to the moves against those members. The king making it very clear that he expects Mohammed bin Salman to succeed him. The king, I think, definitely wants that generational change to be within his immediate line rather than with someone else's. In terms of opposition, we've seen waves of arrests of academics, of civil society advocates, of women, and the kind of all-encompassing nature of those detentions, I just think, have been designed to send a very clear message. If you say anything out of line, you are going to face consequences, that Saudi Arabia now is a place where you simply cannot offer a dissenting opinion. Just in the past couple of days, we've actually had a senior religious cleric who's been removed from his position because he actually tweeted in support and in praise of the virtual G20 meeting that was held last week. He supported the king, saying this is a great move of Saudi Arabia, it shows how great we are. But he also then said, we should also take decisions such as releasing some prisoners from our jails. Of course, the issue of overcrowding and potentially jails can become hotspots of transmission of coronavirus. And that one comment was enough to get him removed, even though he's been completely loyal in the past and was one of the most vocal supporters of the Crown Prince. So it's been very clear that you say one thing and you could be in real trouble. So that's the attempt to try and keep a population in control through coercion or through the threat of the use of force. That can take you halfway. The problem is the other half, you need consent. You cannot just rule on fear alone. And if you do, you run a very risky strategy, as Saddam Hussein found out. And he hasn't yet generated that consent, that respect, because he hasn't really produced those results. And that window of opportunity in 3-4 years, say, if nothing's changed, if Saudis feel cut out from economic prospects, I don't think he'll last forever. We always hear about how he's very popular among young Saudis. And I'm quite sure he is. They finally have someone who looks like them, speaks like, understands what it's like to be a young man or young person in Saudi Arabia today. But if he doesn't deliver, I don't think that support will be open-ended. And that's his one shot to kind of convince people he can deliver. And if he doesn't, because he staked so much of his credibility on the economy and on Vision 2030, it's going to really hit him hard if he really doesn't produce the results.
Okay. Clark Trantham asks, he says the revolutions during, this is a little somewhat related, the revolutions during the Arab Spring were triggered by large unemployment among young people. With the current oil price collapse in Saudi Arabia in danger, or is Saudi Arabia in danger of a similar collapse?
Well, I think part of the reason why so many young Saudis were also in favor of Mohammed Salman coming to prominence was because they already had a huge problem with youth unemployment, which in some areas was 20-30%. And we all think of Saudi Arabia perhaps superficially as a rich country. Of course, its resources are huge. But unlike, say, Kuwait or Qatar or Abu Dhabi, where you spread the oil wealth around less than 1 million people in some cases, in Saudi, there are 22 million Saudis that have to be supported through this oil revenue. So the average Saudi is not well off. I mean, the GDP per capita has halved over the last 40 years as the population has increased. So the notion that you could have an Arab Spring style economic trigger of anger could certainly happen. The difference, I think, at least in Saudi, is because the Saudi society has been divided on so many levels, on sectarian levels, on regional levels, on sort of provincial levels. It's harder to see how pockets of discontent could coalesce into one movement that's able to sort of become so big that it's a political threat. And especially now with the levels of surveillance and the arrests we're seeing, it's hard to imagine people being even allowed to come together in such numbers before they represent that threat. So that's perhaps less of a threat to the Saudi regime. The offset of that, of course, being that the Pensacola shooting, the evidence that there were at least members of the armed forces who were opposition and who were radicalized. In other circumstances, we've seen that that's where regimes get hollowed out if the armed forces turn against you. So I think the Saudi leadership would have been looking at what happened and trying frantically to work out whether this is indicative of a deeper melee, a deeper feeling of anger, or was it just a kind of lone wolf? Because that could be critical, at least going forward.
Okay. And I've got 2 questions about Iran. We have from Eric Bergerson. How dangerous is the situation of backing Iran into a corner? The flooding of the oil market has left Iran with no buyers for their crude and even more extreme instability. And then Colton Cox asks, could you talk more about the rivalry between Arabia and Iran. How did Saudi react to the flare-up between Iran and the US earlier this year?
Well, of course, Iran is being hit extremely badly, not just by the collapse of oil prices and by what little exports they had been kind of able to continue following the maximum pressure campaign of 2019. It's also being hit extremely hard by coronavirus as well. And so we could see a lot of instability, political instability in Iran, especially since it follows so closely from the shooting down of the Ukraine International Airlines jet in January and the subsequent Iranian regime attempt to cover it up. And so again, we're seeing potential people expressing a lack of confidence in their government's ability not only to govern effectively, but also securely and safely. And so we could see a lot of instability in Iran, which maybe 2 years ago would have been welcomed in Saudi Arabia. There were many in Saudi who had felt that it was better to push Iran into that corner and to try and lead to a regime implosion. Even Mohammed bin Salman in 2016 had gone on record as saying, we want to fight Iran, we want to make sure that when there's a battle, it takes place within Iran, not within Saudi Arabia, which was extremely provocative. What we have seen instead is that the Iranians over the past year began to hit out. They began, or at least groups linked with Iran, began to hit out at maritime and energy targets in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the two countries most closely associated with the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign. And that culminated in the attack on Aramco and on the Crude oil field in September. What shocked the Saudis to the core was the lack of a US response. The US responded in December when a US contractor was killed. The US did almost nothing to respond in September. So the message the Saudis took was, we're on our own to a much greater degree than we thought we were in the past. And that has really led to a paring down of Saudi rhetoric, as it has in the UAE as well, towards Iran, a feeling that we actually have to live with Iran on our terms, not necessarily on our terms backed by the US no matter what we do. Contrast that, say, to 2015 when the Saudis and Emiratis went into Yemen. They went into Yemen the same week that the international community was in the final stages of agreeing the interim nuclear deal with Iran. And this was the Saudis' way of saying to the international community, led by President Obama, that we do not trust your approach to Iran. We do not believe your approach of engaging will work. We're going to take action and we expect you to support us. And of course, the US did support the Saudis. Now, however, the Saudis are feeling a bit of the heat as they suddenly have to adapt to a context where they cannot trust whether the US will have their back if something serious happens again. And so that is the context to the US-Iranian escalation, when actually the Saudis, together with the Emiratis and others in the region who have been extremely hawkish, were leading the call for de-escalation, saying this is not the time for another war. We need all parties to de-escalate. So it was a very different message from what we'd heard in 2016 and 17. And it was really one that was a byproduct of the lack of a US response, which I don't know if the US officials had fully anticipated when they chose not to do anything in response to the attack on Aramco in September last year.
Okay, there are several questions still along these lines. That Federico Brown says, what could the US leadership do to persuade Saudi Arabia that our military and financial support comes with certain conditions of reciprocity and embargo, question mark. Eric Bergerson says, if MBS does not stop flooding the market, could you see the White House removing Patriot missile systems out of KSA, some of which were used on Saturday, as you mentioned?
From a Saudi perspective, and this is what a lot of Saudis have been totally blindsided by, This is now the second successive US administration they felt they cannot trust. I mean, they felt they couldn't trust Obama's administration because of the negotiations with Iran. And now they're with Trump's administration, they feel the same. They don't have their back. And so this is going to certainly continue to impact US-Saudi relations, regardless of what happens in November. Either we'll have a re-elected Trump who will continue, I think, his policies which have got the Saudis so nervous, or we'll have a Democrat coming in who will potentially drop that protective shield against congressional pressure for Mohammed bin Salman to be called to account, and who might then certainly be expected to put more conditions of reciprocity and at least make it very clear to the Saudis that if you want to continue to have a good relationship, there have to be strings attached to it. I think a Democrat would especially be forced into that by pressure from the congressional Democrats, given the way they've pushed over the past 2 years for Mohammed bin Salman to be held to account over Jamal Khashoggi. Whether or not that would include the removal of patriots is another issue. I think we have seen, paradoxically, the Trump administration resending forces, US forces, to Prince Sultan Air Base in eastern Saudi Arabia. And Prince Sultan Air Base was the host of US forces in the region up until 2003, when the forward headquarters of Central Command were moved from Saudi Arabia to Qatar. And in part, they were removed because their continuing presence in Saudi Arabia had been one of the energizing factors that Osama bin Laden had successfully tried to kind of mobilize upon in the 1990s. So we're seeing US forces moving back. But again, it's, I think, very clear that US forces are moving back for US interests, not for the interests of Saudi Arabia. And so we may see the beginning of a divergence, where in the past, the Saudis had felt that the US and Saudi strategic objectives and interests were very much on the same page. I now think we're seeing a divergence. And so that may also offer potential leverage for US officials on the Saudis to try and play ball. We saw an example of that last summer, actually, when there was frustration in the Trump administration that the Saudis had pledged I think it was $500 million to the UN for humanitarian support in Yemen. And the Saudis had made that pledge back in March 2019. And by the summer, they still had not given more than a few tens of millions of dollars. And the US government, I mean, the White House effectively summoned MBS's brother, Khalid bin Salman, to DC in August, effectively to tell him that you've got to make good on your pledge. You've got to contribute to the humanitarian support for Yemen. And there were even discussions within the White House as to what could they do to get the Saudis to pay up. Discussions that even went as far as potentially threatening to the Saudis that you would drop the protection against congressional pressure. And whatever was said behind closed doors obviously seemed to work, because within a week of that meeting, the Saudis did disperse the money they had pledged. So I think there was a frustration in the White House, especially, a feeling that we've done so much to protect you over the past year, as it was then, since Khashoggi's death, and you can't even do this in return. So for this most transactional of presidents especially, they may well be thinking, what can we do to try and leverage the Saudis to act in ways that we want them to act, in more so than perhaps in the past?
Do you have comments on what you think is Colton Cox asks, what do you think is the future of the war in Yemen? Have there been important changes in that conflict?
Well, again, as the missiles over the last couple of days demonstrated, the Saudis continue to face a direct threat from Houthi rebels, and a threat they seem to be unable to effectively counter. I mean, they have the Patriots to at least intercept the missiles, but they cannot prevent them from being launched. And the fact that we're still 5 years in a situation where the Saudis are unable to effectively control border security is very far from that strategic victory that Mohammed bin Salman promised within weeks, if not months, in 2015. The Saudis, I think, are desperate to try and leave Yemen. They've now reports are now coming in that they do want to engage again in more talks with the Houthis, which, given that the Houthis have just launched missiles against the Saudi cities, is quite remarkable. They still want to continue talks. I think the challenge for the Saudis is, how do you disengage without losing face? How do you find a way of declaring victory and moving on? I don't think they've got there. I think if they were to leave their Yemeni allies now, you would quickly see a Houthi takeover of even more of Yemen. And we're almost back to square one, where the Saudi decision to move into Yemen was because the Houthis had taken the entire country, even Aden in the south, in January 2015. The Houthi takeover of the entire country actually happened the same night that King Abdullah passed away and that King Salman became king. And that was response to that the Saudis went in the first place to reverse that takeover of the entire country. And they succeeded very much in the south, but they need to find a way of declaring victory, and they haven't been able to do so because I think they know that their local partners and allies in Yemen would probably be powerless to resist any advance were they to withdraw. And so until we get to that point, I think the war will just continue in this holding pattern that we're stuck in. And the Saudis had airstrikes on the capital, Sana'a, yesterday. And so again, it will continue to create political pressure in the US, continue to create anger. And especially if we see a Democrat in the White House, that will translate into consequences, I think, for Mohammed bin Salman. And I think he needs to find a way of disengaging before November if he can.
Okay. And the last question, we need to wrap this up right at 1 o'clock. So is from Bill Rankin. He says, what's your assessment for how the Sunni-led countries in the Middle East are viewing MBS's leadership of Saudi Arabia versus how the Shia-led countries are assessing it, implications for Middle East stability looking forward?
Well, that's an excellent question, the hardest one to last. I mean, there's no monolithic Sunni-Shia blocks. I mean, for example, Qatar is being blockaded by Saudi Arabia, and it's a fellow Wahhabi state, not only a Sunni state, but a Wahhabi state. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are the only two countries in the world which are officially Wahhabi states. And I think part of the frustration in the US at the continuing blockade of Qatar, the continuing rift in the Gulf, is that in May 2017, President Trump, on his first overseas visit as president, went to Saudi Arabia and called for the Sunni Arab world to come together to contain and to push back against Iran. And within 2 weeks, that Sunni Arab world instead turned on itself. So it's hard to say. Again, Hariri in Lebanon, the Lebanese prime minister who was detained by MBS, is a Sunni as well. And arguably, his detention inflamed tension in Lebanon as well, because it boosted Hezbollah, who of course are aligned with Iran. So I think countries across the Middle East are trying to come to terms with the idea that now you have a much more assertive, even aggressive and unpredictable Saudi Arabia, regardless of their kind of political orientation. They realize they have to live with this Saudi for the foreseeable future. And I think that's what will be kind of their primary objective in thinking, how do we work with them politically and economically, rather than there being a sort of Sunni-Shia angle to it, which I think MBS has shown that he's perfectly willing to disregard, to put his own interests and Saudi interests first, and not necessarily to think of Saudi Arabia as the leader of a wider Sunni bloc. I mean, I think he's shown that he's thinking in other ways, and he's shown that in his actions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. This has been very informative. I think we packed a lot in, and appreciate all the great questions from everybody out there. We're up to 90 participants, which is more than we thought we'd have, and we're really happy you all are engaging. Please check your email. You'll be getting a lot of invitations coming from us in the next few weeks. And like I said, forward them to your friends and get other friends and coworkers involved with the Baker Institute and stay in touch with us. Dr. Ulrichsen, thank you so much. And the Baker Institute staff, thank you for organizing and for all your good questions too. We have a lot coming up, so stay in touch. Anything you want to say in conclusion, Dr. Ulrichsen?
Thank you all for taking time out of your day, and please stay safe. And I hope we'll all be able to convene in person at the Baker Institute at some point, whenever that may be. So thank you all very much.
Ditto. We miss seeing everyone. Okay, thanks a lot. Have a great day, everyone.